Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. John Woodcock.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today marks 2 years since the Manchester Arena attack. It was a cowardly and sickening attack that deliberately targeted innocent and defenceless children. Members from across the House will want to join me in sending my thoughts and prayers to the families and friends of all the victims. And I'm sure members will also want to join me in paying tribute to the immense bravery and courage that the emergency services showed that night. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Ranald J. Wardener.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend explain why she ordered that the consultation on the Troubles in Northern Ireland should not contain proposals for a statute of limitations, as was reported in the Sunday Telegraph? And can she update us on what the government will actually get on and do?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, he shouldn't necessarily believe all the reports he reads in the newspapers, but let me be very clear on this particular issue. Around 3,500 people were killed in the Troubles. The vast majority were murdered by terrorists. The legal position is clear. Any amnesty or statute of limitations would have to apply across the board. It would apply to terrorists. I am not prepared to accept a proposal which brings in amnesties for terrorists.
Ian Blackford.
I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister of the heinous crimes that took place 2 years ago in Manchester. We all must stand together against terrorism.
James Heapy.
Thank you, sir.
Colleagues, calm yourselves. Dignity, restraint. Let's hear Mr. Heapy. Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 5th of June, the eyes of the world will be on Portsmouth for D-Day 75. Events planned will give justice to the sacrifices made by veterans, like my own grandfather, and will show Portsmouth to be a place that fosters a legacy of remembrance, reflection, and reconciliation. Our allies in World War II, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US, have all taken the steps to ensure coroners record suicide amongst the veteran community. Prime Minister, why don't we?
Prime Minister.
Can I say, first of all, to the honourable gentleman that it is indeed right that the eyes of the world will be on Portsmouth for the D-Day National Commemorative event. This will be putting our veterans first. It remembers their sacrifices and their achievements, and we will highlight the historic strength of the Western Alliance and the transatlantic partnership. He's raised a specific issue in relation to the coroner's reports, and I will write to him in response to that. But can I say that I look forward, as do others, to being in Portsmouth to commemorate this very important anniversary.
Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, 43 years ago, I, like many others, was ordered to serve in Northern Ireland to keep the peace by terrorists attacking and killing civilians in Northern Ireland. Many of my colleagues and others did not come back, including one, Robert Nairac, a friend, who was tortured, murdered, and whose body has never been found, nor his murderers ever been brought to justice. I simply say to my right honourable friend that in answer to our honourable friend earlier question, she talked about an amnesty. I must tell her that none of those who served have called for an amnesty. What they have called for is fairness and justice. Many, many old veterans now are finding, having been cleared decades ago, that the PSNI is now proceeding against them with no new evidence. Can I please ask her, will she answer me, how is it that I can say to my old colleagues that this government has not abandoned them?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend, we absolutely value the service that he and others did in Northern Ireland. This was a very difficult time for a part of the United Kingdom, and the work that the police did and that the armed forces did in Northern Ireland during that time was absolutely crucial. We are pleased that we've seen the peace that has come since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, but there was obviously much injury and loss of life during the Troubles. As I indicated earlier, around 3,500 people were killed during the Troubles. The vast majority of those were murdered by terrorists. My right honourable friend talks about a fair and just system. We want to ensure that there is a fair and just system that is working across the board to deal with these legacy issues. But what is happening at the moment is that there is a disproportionate emphasis in terms of cases that involve the police and the armed forces. There are cases involving terrorists that are being looked into, but I think people would recognise that there is a disproportionate emphasis on the police and armed forces. What is important is that we therefore bring in a system which has full support and which will enable people to see that fairness and justice being applied. That is what the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland is working on. She has been working on that with the various political parties in Northern Ireland, and it is what we will, in due course, put forward. We recognise the sacrifice and the bravery and determination of our armed forces and the work they did in Northern Ireland, and we too want to see fairness and justice.
Maria Caulfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Returning to Northern Ireland, it's now 2.5 years that there's been no devolved government in Northern Ireland, and every week on the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee we hear about the impact of this on ordinary people, whether it's on quality issues, whether it's funding for the PSNI, whether it's a pay rise for teachers who are paid 6% less than the teachers in the rest of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland is being left behind. Will the Prime Minister do all she can to restore devolution before the end of the year?
Prime Minister.
Can I give my honourable friend that reassurance? I am as keen as she is to ensure that we see the restoration of devolution in Northern Ireland. I believe that recently all the parties have come together with talks with the Secretary of State and as appropriate, the Irish Government, and are ensuring that we are ensuring those talks are continuing. Obviously, there are issues that need to be addressed, concerns from the political parties on different issues. Those need to be overcome such that we can see devolution restored, because, as my honourable friend says, this is a matter for the people of Northern Ireland, and to ensure they have a devolved government that can ensure that good governance in Northern Ireland.
Owen Paterson.
Mr. Speaker, in reply to my right honourable friend for Chingford and Woodford Green, the Prime Minister quite rightly paid tribute to the 300,000 security personnel who, through their courage, professionalism and skill, maintained the rule of law, without which the Belfast Agreement would never have been signed.
Correct.
But she didn't quite answer his question. None of those people who served defending the rule of law want a blanket amnesty. What they want is a categorical assurance that the prosecuting authorities within the existing framework of law will not bring forward a fresh process, and that it is categorical, clear new evidence, and there is an assurance, and no doubt whatever, that a fair trial will proceed.
Well, can I say
Prime
to
Minister.
my right honourable friend, I absolutely appreciate the point that he and our right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Wood Green, has made in relation to this issue. The problem we face in Northern Ireland is that there have been a number of processes which have been aiming to deal with these issues and justice in relation to these deaths during the Troubles. But all of the processes that have been followed so far have been found to be flawed in some way. That is why it is necessary to go through this, the work that we have been doing, to find a process that will not be flawed, that will be legally supportable, and that will enable the fairness and justice that we all want to see to be brought to the fore.
Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For over 2 years now, the victims and survivors of historical institutional abuse in Northern Ireland have been waiting for justice and compensation following the independent report of Mr. Justice Hart, or ex-Justice Hart. The fact of the matter is many of them are dying without seeing the compensation come through. The NIO's policy of refusing to do anything in Northern Ireland, even when it has cross-community and cross-party support, has now come to the culmination of victims of abuse dying without seeing justice. This has got to stop. Will the Prime Minister intervene and make sure that action is taken to to get immediate action for these victims?
Well, can I say to the
Prime Minister?
I fully appreciate the extent of concern that there is about this issue. Of course, we also have our independent inquiry into child sexual abuse here in England and Wales, and I recognise that the impact on all those who've been victims of this sort of abuse, we call it historical. He refers the investigation is referred to as historical investigation. For those who have been victims, it is not historical. It rests with them for the rest of their life. I recognise the concern about the issue that he has raised. Obviously, if the Northern Ireland Executive were in place, this would be a matter that the Northern Ireland Executive would be... No, it would be a matter the Northern Ireland Executive would be addressing. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, has been looking at this issue, and I will help discuss with her what response can be given on what I recognise is a matter of deep concern to many people in Northern Ireland.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question to the Prime Minister from a Northern Ireland veteran. He is Royal Marine David Griffin, a Dublin-born Irish Catholic who joined the British Army, transferred to the Royal Marines. In 1972 in Belfast, he killed an IRA gunman who was about to assassinate one of his comrades at a guard post. 47 years later, he is now being investigated by the PSNI. He is watching these proceedings now, Prime Minister, from his home at the Royal Hospital in Chelsea. He asked me to ask you this. I served my Queen and country in uniform for over 20 years, and I was commended for my service in Northern Ireland. Acting under the lawful orders of my officer commanding, I killed a terrorist who was about to murder one of my comrades, and yet I'm being investigated as if I were a criminal. The IRA have letters of comfort. We don't. Why, Prime Minister, are you pandering to Sinn Féin IRA while throwing veterans like me to the wolves? What is your answer, Prime Minister, to this Chelsea pensioner and all the veterans he represents?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to my honourable friend, he has put his case and that of the veteran he's represented, a Chelsea pensioner, and we thank that individual, as we do all those who served in Northern Ireland, for their bravery and the determination with which they acted in Northern Ireland, which, as my right honourable friend earlier said, former Northern Ireland Secretary said, enabled the peace that we see today in Northern Ireland to take place. It is not the case that the terrorists have an amnesty currently. If there is evidence of... No, if there is, it has been made very clear that evidence of criminal activity will be investigated and people should be brought to justice. What I want to ensure... What I want to ensure is that we do have a fair and just system. At the moment, I do not believe the system is operating fairly. I don't want to see a system where there is an amnesty for terrorists. I want to see a system where investigations can take place in a lawful manner, where the results of those investigations can be upheld and will not be reopened in the future. And in order to do that, we need to change the current system, and that is what we will do.
Johnny Mercer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think the Prime Minister in this House is beginning to understand the level of fury of veterans in this country when it comes to their treatment by this place over the years. But the most disturbing part of last weekend is this insinuation of equivocation between those who got up in the morning to go and murder women and children and civilians, and those who donned a uniform to go and protect the Crown. Can the Prime Minister take this opportunity now to tell the nation she sees no equivocation whatsoever between those two groups, and that the line that preferential treatment should not be given to veterans is not right?
Can I say to my honourable friend, it is absolutely clear, I would have hoped from everything that I have said at this dispatch box, that I value the sacrifice, the bravery, the commitment of our armed forces, whose work in Northern Ireland, alongside the police in Northern Ireland, and others enabled us to get to the stage today that we have the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the peace that we have had in Northern Ireland for many years now, and long may that continue. There is no question of equating that bravery and that sacrifice with the acts of terrorists. But what I would also say to my honourable friend is that what he is, I think, from implication of his question, urging me to do is to put into place a system which would equate terrorists with members of the armed forces. Yes. Any statute of limitations, any amnesty that is put into place would, as a matter of law, have to apply across the board. I do not want to see, and I will not see, an amnesty for the terrorists.
Order.
Goodbye, Theresa May. May you ever dance in our hearts. We'll try our best to overlook the lives you tore apart. You sent them off to countries where they'd never even been, and you leave us with 2 million disenfranchised Europeans. And it seems to me you lived your life like a candle in the windrush, pointing frantically at amber when the blame set in. You were ultimately brought down by your own withdrawal bill. Your premiership's passed long before your deal never will. Dignity we've lost, Grenfell survivors still not housed. Your resignation brought the tears child poverty couldn't arouse. The wretchedness you wrought, you probably should be locked up, but still you might not seem so bad when Boris Johnson rocks up. And it seems to me you lived your life like a candle in the windrush, pointing frantically at amber when the blame set in. You were ultimately brought down by your own withdrawal bill. Your premiership's passed long before your deal never will.